Do you know the feeling when you realize the company you bled for is run by criminals in silk suits? I didn't cry when they fired me in front of the Chicago branch. I just smiled. They had no idea I held the GPS coordinates to a $150,000 secret about to send our CEO to federal prison. Grab a bourbon. I will tell you how I burned their filthy empire to ashes. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero operating budget to keep bringing you these tales of workplace justice. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to afford their living expenses and continue creating for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description and the pinned comment below. I am Elena Stone, 34 years old, and until very recently, I was the Fleet Operations Manager at Aegis Freight Solutions right in the heart of downtown Chicago. If you do not know what a commercial fleet manager actually does, let me paint you a vivid picture. Imagine being the sole person responsible for keeping over 300 rusted, wheezing freight trucks running on the brutal, icy highways of the American Midwest. Now, imagine doing that while upper management treats your crucial maintenance budget like a personal piggy bank. They vehemently refused to open. My days were an endless, exhausting blur of screaming dispatchers, frantic mechanics, and terrified drivers who prayed their transmissions would not drop out onto Interstate 94. Every single time I submitted a requisition form for essential safety parts, like new brake pads, heavy-duty suspension springs, or even just fresh power steering fluid, it would be unceremoniously kicked back to my desk. The rejection always came with a heavily worded email about the necessity of tightening our belts and weathering the economic storm together. That was the absolute favorite catchphrase of our glorious Chief Executive Officer, Richard Vance. Richard was a textbook trust fund baby who had inherited the entire logistics empire from his father. He had never driven a commercial rig, never changed a blown tire in the rain, and definitely never smelled like diesel exhaust in his entire pampered life. Yet, he loved nothing more than to stand at the podium during our mandatory quarterly meetings in his bespoke Italian silk suits, preaching about the nobility of sacrifice for the collective corporate family. Standing right beside him, acting as his corporate executioner, was always Chloe Harper. Chloe was our cold-blooded vice president of human resources. She had a terrifying, almost psychopathic talent for using trendy corporate buzzwords like synergy, agile restructuring, and streamlining to justify cutting our drivers' hard-earned overtime pay and slashing their health insurance coverage tiers. Between the two of them, the company was a masterclass in modern American corporate greed, where the workers starved so the executives could feast. The tipping point of my sanity happened on a miserable, rain-soaked Tuesday in late October. I was sitting at my desk, aggressively rubbing my temples, and scrolling through a digital stack of approved executive purchasing orders. I was desperately trying to find out why my urgent request for 50 new winter tires was denied again. Instead, I found something entirely different buried deep in a secure accounting folder that someone had carelessly left unencrypted. It was a finalized invoice for a brand new Class 8 eco-tractor. The price tag attached to this phantom vehicle was exactly $150,000. What caught my eye was not just the massive amount of money, but the specific funding code attached to the billing line. It was explicitly listed under a federal green energy grant program. According to the paperwork, Aegis Freight Solutions had supposedly purchased a state-of-the-art, eco-friendly hauling truck to reduce our corporate carbon footprint. The problem was that I knew every single vehicle in our yard by heart, and there was absolutely no green eco-tractor sitting anywhere in our entire Chicago fleet. I spent my entire lunch break physically searching the mud-filled yard and questioning the warehouse managers, but nobody had seen any new equipment arrive. I honestly thought it was just a massive clerical error. That was until I walked out of the main glass entrance to grab a coffee at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. As I stood under the awning to escape the drizzle, the distinct, aggressive roar of a monstrous engine ripped through the damp Chicago air. A brand new, smoke gray Porsche 911. Turbo S pulled smoothly into the executive VIP parking lot. It was so polished and pristine that it practically mirrored the dark gray clouds above us. The driver's side door popped open, and out stepped Richard Vance. He tossed his keys to the security guard with a sickeningly smug grin and adjusted his silk tie. My stomach instantly dropped into my shoes. I rushed back up to my office, locked the door, and immediately pulled up the current market value of a fully loaded smoke gray Porsche 911 Turbo S on the internet. I added the base price, the premium package options, the luxury destination fees, and the state taxes. The final number blinking back at me on the screen was exactly $150,000, down to the very last decimal. The math was completely undeniable. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the jaw. Richard was not just denying my mechanics the vital funds they needed to keep our drivers alive on the road. He was actively committing massive federal financial fraud. He used the United States government green energy subsidy to buy himself a German luxury supercar, laundering the money through the company books as an eco-friendly commercial vehicle. Meanwhile, I had single fathers out on the freezing highways, hauling 20 tons of steel with brake lines that were literally held together by duct tape and blind faith. The bone-deep exhaustion I had felt for the past 3 years vanished in an instant. The smoldering frustration that usually kept me awake at night suddenly crystallized into a cold, ruthless, and terrifying determination. I did not want to just quit. I did not want to just report him to human resources, because Chloe would have buried the evidence before I could even hit send. I wanted to see Richard Vance lose his freedom. I wanted to see his entire filthy empire burn to ashes. The game was officially on. I knew the golden rule of surviving a corporate slaughterhouse. You never scream, and you never report a crime to the people who sign the paychecks. If I had walked into the Human Resources Department the next morning waving that fraudulent invoice around, the paper trail would have been permanently wiped from the internal servers within 15 minutes. They would have fired me for unauthorized access to executive files, escorted me out of the building, and that would be the end of it. Rich criminals do not play by the rules of morality. They play by the rules of documentation. To destroy Richard, I needed something they could not delete. I needed an invisible snare. My position gave me absolute, unrestricted access to the most secure areas of our logistics hub. On a quiet Thursday evening, long after the dispatchers had gone home, I stayed behind under the pretense of running inventory audits. I made my way to the high-value asset locker situated in the basement. I keyed in my 6-digit security code and bypassed the standard, bulky commercial tracking devices we used for everyday freight. I went straight to the reinforced steel cabinet in the back. Inside sat our emergency supply of military-grade micro-tracking units. We used these stealth devices strictly for hauling highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar government payloads. The unit was small, roughly the size of a standard Zippo lighter. Encased in matte black shockproof rubber, it featured a rare earth neodymium magnet that could grip a steel chassis with 200 pounds of sheer force, and an internal lithium battery guaranteed to transmit continuously for 120 days without needing a single charge. I slipped it into my pocket and waited for the perfect tactical window. Mother Nature provided my cover the very next night. A massive, violent thunderstorm rolled in from Lake Michigan, battering the city of Chicago with freezing, horizontal rain. At exactly 11:15 at night, I checked the security camera feeds from my office terminal. The Executive VIP parking lot was completely empty, except for that glistening, smoke-gray German sports car sitting under a single flickering sodium lamp. I grabbed my black rain jacket, pulled the hood tightly over my head, and slipped out through the side loading dock doors. The freezing wind instantly bit through my clothes, and the heavy rain masked the sound of my footsteps against the wet asphalt. I approached the vehicle from the blind spot of the external security cameras. The ground clearance of a luxury sports car is notoriously, punishingly low. It was barely 4.5 inches off the concrete. I dropped to my knees into a freezing puddle and lay flat on my back. I forcefully wedged my shoulders underneath the rear bumper. gritting my teeth as icy water dripped directly from the exhaust pipe onto my face and neck. The smell of premium gasoline and hot metal filled my nose. My fingers blindly traced the freezing, complex geometry of the undercarriage until I found a secure, recessed cavity safely tucked away near the rear axle, completely invisible to any mechanic doing a routine oil change. I pressed the device flat against the steel framework. The heavy metallic snap of the magnet engaging sounded deafening to my racing heart, but a perfectly timed roll of thunder swallowed the noise whole. I scrambled out from beneath the car, completely soaked, wiped the grease off my trembling hands, and practically vanished back into the dark building. Back in the total isolation of my locked office, I began the digital phase of my trap. I was not stupid enough to connect a stolen tracking device to the company network. Instead, I tethered my personal laptop to an untraceable cellular hotspot and routed the incoming signal through a military-grade virtual private network. I rented a secure, anonymous cloud server hosted in Switzerland, paying the $99 setup fee using a prepaid debit card. I wrote a custom, 256-bit encrypted script that automatically pulled the latitude and longitude data from the device every 30 seconds. Suddenly, a bright green dot pulsed on my screen. I was now watching every single movement the chief executive officer made, entirely off the grid. Over the next 48 hours, I meticulously built an airtight physical dossier. I printed the forged purchasing order for the eco-tractor, the corresponding federal grant approval documents, and every single rejected maintenance request I had submitted over the past 12 months. I cross-referenced the dates and times of the financial transfers with the real-time movements of the green dot. I placed all of these documents into a fireproof combination safe hidden underneath the floorboards of my apartment. If they managed to fire me, the truth would still exist in hard copy. However, keeping a secret of this magnitude emits a certain frequency, and predators have an incredible sense of smell. By Wednesday morning, the storm clouds inside the office began to gather. Chloe Harper materialized in my doorway without a single warning. She did not knock. She carried a sleek leather folder and wore a chillingly polite smile that entirely failed to reach her eyes. She practically glided across the room and dropped the folder right onto my keyboard, trapping my hands. "Good morning, Elena," Chloe purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We have a slight operational bottleneck I need your help clearing up today. I need your official authorization signature on the annual fleet emissions report. It includes the mandatory carbon offset data for the new Class 8 vehicle." I looked down at the documents. The pages were filled with fabricated statistics about reduced diesel consumption and lowered carbon emissions. Placing my signature on that line would legally bind me to the fraud. It would transform me from a bystander into a documented accomplice. I kept my face perfectly blank, slowly sliding the folder back toward her side of the desk. "I cannot sign off on an emissions test for a vehicle I have never physically inspected. Chloe, company policy is extremely clear on safety verification," I replied, keeping my tone strictly professional. The fake smile instantly melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, calculating malice. She leaned over my desk, her expensive perfume suddenly smelling suffocatingly strong. "You really need to look at the bigger picture here," she whispered, her voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening register. "Richard considers this compliance check a top priority for our corporate health. It would be an absolute tragedy if your sudden refusal to be a team player resulted in a permanent restructuring of your employment status. We would hate to lose you. Just sign the paper, Elena." I leaned back in my chair, looking her directly in her cold eyes. My pulse was pounding, but my voice remained like ice. "My signature requires a physical inspection. Bring the new eco-tractor into my main maintenance bay. Let me plug my diagnostic tools into its engine, and I will gladly sign whatever document you need." Chloe stared at me for 3 agonizingly long seconds. The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush coal into diamonds. She aggressively snatched the folder off the desk, her knuckles turning white. "You are making a catastrophic career mistake," she hissed through clenched teeth. She spun on her high heels and marched out of my office, slamming the door so hard the glass panes rattled in their frames. The silent war was over. The physical execution was about to begin. The email hit every single inbox across the entire company network at exactly 6:45 on Monday morning. The subject line read, "Mandatory all-hands operational update. Location, main freight hangar. Time, 8 o'clock sharp." When an emergency meeting is called in the logistics industry before the sun has even fully risen, the air instantly turns thick with dread. Every mechanic, dispatcher, and driver knew the unspoken translation of that corporate subject line. The guillotine was being wheeled out onto the floor, and heads were about to roll. By 5 minutes to 8, the cavernous, drafty warehouse was packed with nearly 400 employees. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, a heavy silence broken only by the nervous shuffling of steel-toed boots on the oil-stained concrete floor. I stood near the middle section, surrounded by my dedicated maintenance crew. They looked completely terrified, whispering frantically among themselves about impending budget cuts and mortgage payments. I simply crossed my arms, knowing exactly whose neck was on the chopping block today. Richard Vance stepped up onto the makeshift wooden podium, perfectly illuminated by the harsh overhead fluorescent lights. He wore a somber, tailored navy blue suit, playing the role of a burdened, compassionate leader to absolute perfection. He gripped the edges of the podium, bowing his head slightly before speaking into the microphone. He spent the first 10 minutes weaving a masterful, deceitful narrative about global economic headwinds, the crushing reality of inflation, and how wholesale diesel fuel costs had spiked by almost 30% over the last quarter. He used the phrase protecting the Aegis family at least 3 times, his voice practically trembling with manufactured grief as he announced that painful structural layoffs were completely unavoidable to save our sinking ship. Then, he stepped back, and the true executioner took the stage. Chloe Harper grabbed the microphone. She did not look mournful. She looked hungry for violence. Instead of discussing broad departmental cuts, she abruptly changed the entire tone of the meeting. She began talking about company culture, the absolute necessity of total alignment, and how toxic elements within the management team could no longer be tolerated during a massive financial crisis. Her cold eyes scanned the massive crowd and locked directly onto me. The temperature in the room seemed to physically plummet. "We cannot navigate these difficult waters when certain leaders actively refuse to row in the same direction," Chloe announced, her voice echoing sharply off the corrugated steel ceiling. "Specifically, when individuals engage in blatant, documented insubordination, when they actively foster division among our hard-working frontline staff, and when they aggressively refuse to cooperate on vital federally mandated compliance projects." The entire hangar collectively held its breath. The mechanic standing directly next to me subtly shifted away, leaving me entirely isolated in a small circle of empty space. Chloe raised her chin, delivering the fatal blow with terrifying volume. "Elena, your deliberate sabotage of corporate initiatives is unacceptable. Effective immediately. Your employment with Aegis Freight Solutions is permanently terminated. You are to hand over your access credentials right now." She snapped her fingers, and 2 massive private security contractors in dark uniforms instantly materialized from the side doors, marching directly toward my position. Chloe had orchestrated this entire spectacle to be a brutal, unforgettable public humiliation. She wanted to parade me out of the building like a common criminal to strike fear into the hearts of anyone else who might ever think about questioning their ultimate authority. They expected me to burst into tears, to scream defensively, to beg for my severance package, or to crumble onto the cold concrete in disgrace. I did absolutely none of those things. A profound, icy calmness washed over my entire body. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I slowly and deliberately unclipped the plastic employee identification badge from my jacket lapel. I let it slip freely from my fingers. The hard plastic hit the concrete floor with a sharp, echoing clack that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. I turned on my heel, ignoring the approaching security guards entirely, and began the long, slow walk down the center aisle toward the main exit doors. The massive crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I kept my posture completely straight, my head held high, and a faint, knowing smile playing on my lips. As I approached the final row of folding chairs near the back exit, I spotted exactly who I was looking for. Sitting quietly in the corner, balancing a cheap leather pad folio on his lap, was Marcus Thorne. He was the independent government auditor dispatched from the Federal Oversight Committee to monitor our grant compliance, proudly invited today by Richard to witness how efficiently the company was being restructured. He was furiously taking notes. I slowed my pace until I was standing right beside his chair, up on the distant stage. I could see Richard leaning forward, his eyes narrowed, watching my every single move like a paranoid hawk. I tilted my head down toward the auditor, keeping my tone conversational, yet projecting my words clearly enough to carry through the dead silence of the entire warehouse. "Mr. Thorne," I said cheerfully, "before you wrap up your comprehensive audit today, you really should double-check the carbon emissions output on that new Class 8 eco-tractor parked out in the VIP lot." I did not pause to wait for his confused response. I instantly shifted my gaze back up to the podium. The effect was absolutely magnificent. Richard's perfectly composed, sorrowful mask shattered into a million jagged pieces. His jaw physically dropped open, and every single drop of blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking like a panicked, suffocating ghost. Chloe practically dropped the heavy microphone. My half-smile widened into a genuine, terrifying grin. I pushed open the heavy metal exit doors, stepped out into the crisp morning sunlight of Chicago, and let the heavy doors slam shut behind me. The countdown had officially begun. I found a dark, sticky-floored dive bar exactly 5 miles down the highway from the main freight terminal. I ordered a cheap draft beer, slid into a cracked leather booth in the back corner, and flipped open my laptop. The company information technology department thought they were absolute geniuses when they revoked my official network credentials the exact second my termination was announced. They completely forgot that I was the very same person who installed the auxiliary diagnostic servers for the heavy maintenance bays 3 years ago. I still had an undetectable, fully operational administrative backdoor wired directly into the master security system. I typed in a command line, and instantly, a high-definition grid of internal surveillance camera feeds and audio channels populated my screen. I clicked on the audio feed for the executive hallway and leaned back against the vinyl seat to enjoy the show. Marcus Thorne was no longer the quiet, polite government auditor sitting in the back row of an employee meeting. He was practically pinning Richard against the frosted glass wall of the main boardroom. Even through the tiny speakers of my laptop, I could hear the absolute panic vibrating in our chief executive officer's voice. Thorne was aggressively demanding to see the new eco-tractor right that very second. He wanted a physical inspection of the chassis identification number before he boarded his return flight to Washington. Richard was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he frantically loosened his expensive silk tie. He stuttered out a pathetic, poorly constructed lie about the vehicle being dispatched on a critical emergency freight route to Detroit. When Thorne instantly challenged the logistics of that, Richard quickly changed his story, stammering that the truck was actually at a third-party commercial dealership undergoing mandatory warranty maintenance. Thorne did not buy a single syllable of it. He slammed his leather pad folio shut and told Richard he had exactly 48 hours to produce the physical vehicle before a formal federal criminal investigation was launched. It was time to turn up the heat. While they were arguing, I opened a hidden terminal window on my screen and executed a custom batch script I had written over the weekend. Our corporate office utilized an integrated radio frequency identification badge system tied directly to the building public address speakers. Usually, it just chimed pleasantly when someone entered a restricted zone. I had completely rerouted Richard's specific magnetic badge signature. On my screen, I watched Richard finally escape the wrath of the auditor and storm furiously toward his private corner office suite. He forcefully slapped his badge against the wall reader. The moment the magnetic lock clicked open, the automated emergency broadcasting system hijacked every single speaker inside the corporate headquarters. Instead of a pleasant chime, a robotic, Synthesized female voice blasted at maximum volume across the sales floor, the maintenance bays, and the executive suites. If you have information regarding federal grant fraud, corporate embezzlement, or misuse of government subsidies, please contact the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network hotline immediately at 1-800-555-0199. I watched the security feed as Richard jumped back from his heavy oak door like he had just been electrocuted. Dozens of employees popped their heads over their cubicles, staring directly at him in shock. He frantically swiped his card again, trying to reset the system, but my script was perfectly, ruthlessly locked in. If you have information regarding federal grant fraud, the voice echoed again, significantly louder this time. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my cold beer. He was trapped in a digital haunted house of his own making, and there was no way out. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my untraceable burner phone started ringing. It was not Richard or Chloe. It was a restricted number belonging to a senior partner at a massive, incredibly expensive corporate litigation firm based in downtown Chicago. The lawyer did not bother with any professional pleasantries. He immediately launched into a vicious, highly rehearsed monologue designed to terrify me into absolute submission. He explicitly threatened to tie me up in predatory civil lawsuits for the next 10 years. He promised to sue me into total, irreversible personal bankruptcy for corporate espionage, defamation, and breach of contract. Then came the golden carrot. If I agreed to sign an ironclad, permanent non-disclosure agreement and physically hand over whatever alleged evidence I thought I possessed, they would wire exactly $200,000 into my bank account by the end of the business day. They politely framed it as a generous severance package adjustment. To them, $200,000 was just pocket change used to sweep a major federal crime under the rug. To me, it was concrete proof that they were bleeding out and completely terrified of what I held. I did not say a single word. I did not confirm or deny anything. I simply pressed the red button to disconnect the call and dropped the phone onto the sticky wooden table. Let them sweat and bleed legal fees. I switched my laptop screen over to the secure server hosting my tracking software. I fully expected to see the red dot of the global positioning system resting safely in the executive parking lot. Instead, the red dot was moving rapidly away from the downtown business district, heading straight toward the industrial warehouse sector on the far south side of the city. I cross-referenced the current coordinates with a digital property map, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. The location unfolding on my screen revealed a conspiracy so monstrous and vile, it made the federal vehicle fraud look like a harmless accounting mistake. The glowing red dot on my screen did not make any sense. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, nursing a cold cup of black coffee, watching the digital map update in real time. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday. The chief executive officer of a major logistics firm should be asleep in his downtown penthouse. Instead, the tracker attached to the undercarriage of Richard's German sports car was parked dead center inside a massive industrial freight yard on the south side. I zoomed in on the satellite imagery. The bold white letters painted across the warehouse roof spelled out Vanguard Freight Worldwide. They were our largest, most aggressive regional competitor. A freezing chill crept up the back of my neck. Embezzling $150,000 from a federal grant was a crime of pure vanity and greed, but sneaking into a rival terminal in the dead of night, that was an entirely different species of poison. I pulled up the historical location data from the cloud server. Over the past 3 weeks, the Porsche had made this exact same midnight journey 7 times. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tapping into the encrypted backup drives I had secured before they locked me out. I started cross-referencing our recent quarterly losses with the dates of those late-night visits. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. For months, Aegis had been mysteriously losing our most lucrative, long-standing contracts. These were our golden routes, the high margin, dedicated shipping lanes that kept our entire operation afloat. Every time our sales team placed a bid to renew a contract, Vanguard Freight miraculously swooped in and underbid us by a fraction of a percent. It was statistically impossible unless they had our exact internal pricing models. I picked up my burner phone and dialed a number I had not called in 5 years. Marcus was an old college friend who now worked as a senior night dispatcher over at Vanguard. I owed him a massive favor, and tonight I was cashing it in. After 10 minutes of carefully worded questions and avoiding the corporate surveillance systems, Marcus confirmed my worst nightmare. Richard was not just visiting, he was personally handing over our core client manifests, our operational vulnerabilities, and our exact profit margins on a silver platter to Vanguard management. But why would a man intentionally burn down his own inheritance? I dug deeper, accessing a shadow database of corporate shell companies and offshore holdings. I spent 4 straight hours untangling a web of anonymous limited liability corporations registered in Delaware. At exactly 6:15 in the morning, the ugly, rotting heart of the conspiracy finally revealed itself. Richard was a silent, unlisted partner in a ruthless private equity firm operating out of New York. His entire game plan was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. He was deliberately bleeding Aegis dry, intentionally driving our stock price into the absolute gutter, and orchestrating a massive financial crisis. Once the company was completely devalued and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, his private equity firm would swoop in as a savior and acquire Aegis for absolute pennies on the dollar. They would instantly liquidate our assets, sell off the valuable real estate, and dissolve the company entirely. Richard would personally walk away with tens of millions in a golden parachute, while 3,000 hardworking drivers, mechanics, and warehouse staff would be thrown onto the street without a single cent of severance pay. The federal government moves at a glacial pace. If I handed this dossier over to the auditor, it would take the Department of Justice 2 years to build a case, file subpoenas, and schedule hearings. By then, the private equity firm would have already cannibalized Aegis, and my people would be financially ruined. I needed a much faster, far more lethal weapon. I did not need the government. I needed the apex predators. Aegis was technically a publicly traded entity, but the vast majority of the voting power was controlled by the board of directors. These were 5 incredibly wealthy, fiercely protective institutional investors who absolutely despised losing money. They were the real sharks swimming in the deep water, and Richard was secretly trying to steal their meat. While I compiled the explosive data packet, Richard and Chloe were spiraling into total paranoid madness. My internal spies in the executive suite texted me updates throughout the day, ever since my parting comment about the exhaust emissions. Richard realized I knew exactly where his vehicle was at all times. He became convinced his entire life was bugged. He refused to use his office phone. He forced Chloe to communicate through handwritten notes. By early evening, he was so terrified that he hired a team of black market mechanics from the east side to completely tear his pristine sports car apart. Through a grainy security feed from a nearby street camera, I watched them rip out the custom Italian leather seats, dismantle the dashboard, and tear the luxury interior down to the bare metal. They scanned every inch of the cabin with expensive radio frequency detectors. They found absolutely nothing, because they were looking for a standard listening device inside the car. They never thought to check the filthy, oil-soaked recess deep inside the rear suspension framework where my military-grade tracker sat silently, transmitting his every failure. He had destroyed a $150,000 masterpiece looking for a ghost. At exactly 9 o'clock that night, I bypassed the standard corporate firewalls entirely. I routed a highly encrypted, untraceable email directly into the private, personal inboxes of all 5 members of the board of directors. The attachment contained everything: the falsified eco-tractor invoices, the undeniable global positioning logs proving his midnight trips to Vanguard, the shell company registration documents tying him to the private equity firm, and a detailed summary of how he was actively conspiring to defraud his own shareholders. I hit send, closed my laptop, and poured myself a tall glass of water. The explosion happened exactly 2 hours later. My phone screen lit up, vibrating aggressively against the wooden table. The caller identification displayed a private international number. I answered on the 3rd ring. Ms. Stone, a deep, gravelly voice echoed through the speaker. It was Jonathan Sterling, the chairman of the board. He sounded like a man barely suppressing a volcanic eruption of rage. I have just spent the last 2 hours reviewing a very fascinating compilation of bedtime reading. We have frozen all executive access and locked down the building. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, I replied calmly. I assume you found the geographical data regarding Vanguard Freight particularly enlightening. Enlightening is a mild word, Sterling practically growled. I am currently boarding my private jet in London. I will be touching down in Chicago at dawn. I am convening an emergency tribunal of the board at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning in the main conference room. I want you sitting at my right hand, inside that room, acting under the official title of Special Corporate Advisor. We are going to cut the cancer out of this company, and I want you holding the scalpel. Will you be there? I looked out my window at the glowing skyline of the city. I would not miss it for the world. Sir. The board was set. The king was trapped. Checkmate was only hours away. At exactly 8:45 the next morning, I walked through the main glass doors of Aegis Freight Solutions. I was no longer wearing my standard issue warehouse jacket and steel-toed boots. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray power suit. The bustling lobby instantly fell dead silent. Every dispatcher, receptionist, and junior manager stopped dead in their tracks, staring in absolute shock at the woman who had been publicly fired just 2 days prior. Their collective gasp was entirely justified when Jonathan Sterling, the fiercely intimidating chairman of the board, stepped out of the private executive elevator and personally extended his hand to greet me. He escorted me straight past the whispering crowd and directly into the penthouse boardroom. Inside the massive, glass-walled room, the atmosphere was as suffocating as a tomb. The other 4 board members sat motionless around the polished mahogany table, their expressions carved from solid stone. Richard and Chloe were already seated at the far end. When they saw me walk in shoulder to shoulder with the chairman, every single drop of blood violently drained from their faces. Richard looked absolutely pathetic. His eyes were bloodshot from his all-night teardown of his sports car, and his hands were physically shaking against the table. Chloe sat frozen, her usual arrogant posture completely collapsing in on itself. Sterling did not bother with any formal introductions. He gestured toward the head of the table. "The floor is yours. Elena," he commanded, his voice echoing off the glass. I stepped up to the digital projector and connected my tablet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The raw data was loud enough. I tapped the screen, illuminating the wall with the high-resolution map, tracking the nocturnal movements of the gray sports car. "What you are looking at," I stated with lethal calmness, "is the precise global positioning data of our Chief Executive Officer. This visualizes his frequent 2 o'clock morning visits to Vanguard Freight worldwide over the past month." I swiped to the next slide, displaying the confidential internal emails I had intercepted, alongside the shell company registration documents. Furthermore, these are the legal frameworks for a hostile private equity takeover. Richard has been intentionally feeding our proprietary client manifests and profit margins directly to our primary competitor. His goal was to intentionally bankrupt Aegis, tank your stock portfolios, and allow his shadow firm to acquire the ashes for a fraction of their actual value. Richard violently pushed his chair back, gasping for air as if he were drowning. "Elena, please," he stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "We can work this out. I can double the severance. I can give you whatever you want. Just stop the presentation. Have mercy." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. "You did not show any mercy to the mechanics you starved, or the drivers you sent out on the ice with failing brakes," I replied softly. "You used a $150,000 federal environmental grant to buy a luxury vehicle, and then you used that exact same vehicle to transport our corporate secrets to the enemy. There is no negotiation left." Before Richard could utter another pathetic defense, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom violently swung open. 3 federal agents in dark windbreakers marched into the room, their badges gleaming under the recessed lighting. Marcus Thorne, the government auditor, stepped in right behind them. He gave me a brief, respectful nod. "Richard Vance," the lead agent announced, stepping directly behind the trembling executive. "You are under arrest for federal financial fraud, embezzlement of government funds, and felony corporate espionage." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the silent boardroom was the greatest symphony I had ever heard. They hauled him to his feet and marched him out the door. Sterling then turned his icy gaze toward the Vice President of Human Resources. "Chloe," he said quietly, "you are immediately terminated with zero severance. Furthermore, I will personally ensure that your name is permanently blacklisted across the entire national logistics industry. Security will escort you off the premises. Do not ever show your face in Chicago again." With the garbage successfully taken out, the board officially offered me the position of Chief Executive Officer on the spot. I politely declined. I had absolutely no desire to spend the rest of my life sitting in a glass tower. Instead, I accepted an astronomical financial settlement for wrongful termination. That payout, combined with the mandatory federal whistleblower reward percentage from the recovered grant money, ensured I would never have to work another day in my life unless I actively chose to do so. An hour later, I walked out into the bright morning sun and climbed into my beautifully restored, vintage 1968 Ford Mustang. I fired up the roaring engine and slowly cruised past the executive VIP parking lot. A massive flatbed tow truck was currently winching the completely dismantled, destroyed remains of the gray Porsche up onto its ramp. It was a beautiful piece of modern art. I smiled, shifted into gear, and accelerated onto the busy Chicago streets, leaving the crumbling remnants of their filthy empire far behind in my rearview mirror. Thank you so much to all our amazing listeners for tuning into this story today. Please let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this tale of ultimate workplace justice, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment. Your incredible generosity helps us pay our dedicated staff, allowing them to support their families, and continue bringing you these satisfying revenge stories. Stay strong, and never let them walk all over you.